If you're a space enthusiast, you need to see this book. Gemini and Mercury Remastered is the definitive collection of newly restored photos from NASA's space program. Hi, I'm Dan Skinner, and this is Some Books Considered. Andy Saunders is one of the world's foremost experts of NASA digital restoration and the author of the best-selling Apollo Remastered. Andy, welcome to Some Books Considered.
Thank you for having me on.
Well, this is the second book you've done where you've restored pictures from NASA. How did you get involved and get interested in doing this?
I've just always had an absolute obsession with particularly the moon landings, but any kind of that early human space exploration since childhood. I'm not really sure why. I can't put my finger on the exact moment. I remember being fascinated with anything that could fly, actually, but rockets seemed like the ultimate flying machine. I remember looking at the moon through a little toy telescope again as a child and being amazed at how this two-dimensional disc in the sky suddenly became three-dimensional, like a world. I thought, oh, you could go and visit that world in a rocket. That seemed like the ultimate adventure, the ultimate journey. I was born in 1974. Apollo 17 was 1972, so I didn't know. And then when I learned that actually, well, we've done that and we've walked around on the moon, that started my complete obsession with, who were these people? What did they look like? What did the spacecraft look like? So the first book then was Apollo Remastered, which of course was about the Apollo program. And this one is the prequel because it's about those missions that came before Apollo, Mercury and Gemini. So the very first missions into space, and Gemini that then taught us everything that we needed to know and prove all of the techniques necessary to then reach for the moon on the Apollo program. So always just had a fascination with photography as well. So, what better way than to unite those two passions by working on this incredible film.
Well, we won't be able to talk about everything that's in the book, obviously, but give us a brief overview. What can people expect to find here?
Well, there's around 300 full. It's a large scale kind of coffee table book. You would perhaps think of it as a photo book, but actually there's a lot of research in it. There's captions for every image. There's an introduction to every mission. So what I've tried to do is basically reconstruct every single mission from Project Mercury and Gemini, from launch to splashdown, to tell the stories as well of these missions, as well as looking at the new stunning imagery. We can read along and follow the missions. So it tells that complete story of how we went from seeing the first image of the curvature of Earth through to learning everything we'd need, like say, to go on and voyage to the moon. So the imagery is absolutely stunning. It's new, it's digitally remastered from the original film. So we're able to see this incredibly important era as never before. So that is really the focus of the book. But Gemini in particular, firstly, a lot of people don't know that much about Gemini, but these were 10 missions in 20 months. It was an extraordinary pace of development. The US was trying to catch up with the Soviets. So they were taking some quite incredible risks. I mean, when people read the book, I think they'll be quite surprised at the level of risk that was taken. And as such, the human drama that unfolds in every mission is quite an eye-opener. So I wanted to tell those stories alongside the imagery.
Well, you mentioned the very first picture taken from space. We have John Glenn to thank for that. Tell us about how that came about.
Yeah, there were other images from space, but not taken by one of us. And that's kind of the key. So when Yuri Gagarin went up, for example, they just had some live TV as he passed over a tracking station. On Alan Shepard's mission and John Glenn, the first two Mercury missions, Shepard being the first American in space, of course, it was a camera that was automatically taking photographs out of the window. But John Glenn, on his mission, NASA didn't want the early astronauts to take a camera on board. They would be far too busy. These were short missions, I say really bold, groundbreaking missions, and they had a lot to do. So they didn't want them to be messing around with a camera and taking photographs. But he said, no, people are going to want to know what it's like to be an astronaut. I'm going to see things no one's ever seen before. And he wanted to share that. So he spotted a $40 camera in a drugstore on his way back from a haircut as he was training and said, that's perfect. I'm going to take this camera on my mission. NASA adapted it with a little pistol grip to make it easier to use in the capsule. And with it, he took the first still handheld photographs of Earth from space.
Photographs in space are fascinating, but in at least one case that you reported could be misleading because a NASA scientist thought he discovered a new constellation, but it turned out to be something else.
So that was Gemini 6A. So Gemini 6A and 7 were the first ever rendezvous in space. This will be critical for Apollo again, to have two spacecraft meet in orbit. Can we maneuver? Can we meet? And then eventually dock, which happened on Gemini 8. So this was a really pivotal moment in spaceflight history. But yes, they got back to Earth, and an NASA astronomer was going through the photographs, and they saw this one. And actually, I genuinely think this is one of the most beautiful images in the book. There's a glow of Earth, blue glow of Earth below, and then all these what look like super bright white star field. And the NASA astronomer asked Shearer, well, which constellation is this, Wally? And he said, well, that's a constellation urine, because in fact it was frozen urine. But it's the astronauts enjoyed this spectacle when they did the urine dump overboard. It instantly froze into these spheres, frozen spheres, and in space the sunlight is bright white because, of course, it hasn't been filtered through the atmosphere. So when that bright white sunlight illuminated all these thousands of particles, it produced this quite stunning image.
I'm talking with Andy Saunders about Gemini and Mercury Remastered, and our conversation continues in a moment. If you're enjoying this discussion, please subscribe, like, and click on the bell so you know when I post new interviews. And thank you. This story is told not just with the photos, but also with the communications, the transmissions between, master control and the spacecraft. So you sort of get a minute-by-minute story. So it's almost like watching this unravel in real time, and you get that behind-the-scenes stories that the pictures alone can't provide.
That's exactly something I wanted to do, was to reconstruct every mission so that we can follow along and, like I say, tell not only these technological achievements, but the human drama that also unfolded. So to be able to reconstruct every mission, I had to work out when every photograph was taken. If they were taking 16mm movie film, for example, when were these scenes taken? They took multiple cameras and multiple magazines. So it's not simply a case of following the frame numbers, because they could have taken a photograph with this camera and then this camera and then a bit of 16mm film. So I had to reconstruct by using the mission transcript. So almost every word that was spoken on every mission I read, because it was transcribed and later declassified in the 70s by NASA. And if anyone's really into this, I can recommend reading them, because it really is an eye-opener. Particularly interesting are the conversations between the astronauts themselves when they were out of ground contact. So I could use that. I could use clues, visual clues in the imagery itself, the astronauts' memoirs, things I could see in the imagery. For example, on John Glenn's mission, they had a mirror on the chest, and the 16mm film was filming them, and we can see the instrument console. So, for example, in the transcripts where he says, okay, such an indicator light has just gone green, I can actually find that in the film, and then I know exactly where we are in the mission. So using all those clues is how I've basically built up and reconstructed every mission. So it's a little bit like a visual documentary, a blow-by-blow account of every mission of how we conquered space.
Well, tell us a little bit about the restoration process, and specifically, the 16mm film wasn't that sharp, so you had to use a special technique to bring out those details.
Yeah, there's two key things I do with the Apollo book, and it was the same with this book, is for the still photographs, the most important thing is to use the original film. So this is the actual film that was in the cameras on the moon that had been locked away in this frozen vault for half a century in Houston. NASA finally took that out of that frozen vault and digitally scanned it to a really high resolution, high bit depth. And it's using those raw files of the actual film, applying some digital processing to them that means we can, see these missions in this era as never before. They look quite dull and lifeless straight out of the scanner because it's ultimately analog film and a photograph of them. But applying digital processing, we can pull out, there's just so much visual information hidden within them, just waiting to be revealed. So that's the key for the still images. For the 16mm film, you're right. So what I do with that is basically split out this movie film into its individual frames, And if you can perfectly align them and stack them on top of each other and consolidate them, you basically, you boost the signal, but you don't boost the noise or like the grain, if you like. So we improve the quality. And again, we can just pull out detail that we've just never been able to see before. Particularly useful on this book is the Mercury missions. So to be able to now step on board these tiny spacecraft and see Alan Shepard, John Glenn, Alan Shepard waiting for launch, the moment he enters space, the moment John Glenn enters orbit, and we can see even a reflection in his visor of the booster of the rocket, signifying that he's entered orbit, and a particularly haunting image of him during re-entry. So yes, two really key digital processing techniques are used. What's really important to note is absolutely no AI, artificial intelligence, has been used. You know, this is historically important footage. I think when you apply AI to a photograph, it just loses all of its provenance. So it's really important to do this sympathetically, digitally, but kind of manually. My objective is never to embellish or reimagine. It's just to bring clarity, to peel back the layers of noise and degradation and aging so that we can see what was inherently in that film, but in a way we've never been able to see before.
One of the things that struck me is, yes, the pictures of space were beautiful and the pictures of the technology, but it was the expression on the faces of the astronauts as they were going through this life-changing experience.
Yeah, we see, like I say, with this technique, we can now see them really. We can almost see the pores in their skin. So we see Alan Shepard waiting to become the first American, waiting for launch to become the first American in space. We can see that kind of anticipation. We see exhaustion after a spacewalk. We see focus. We see the hands on the controls. We see the trepidation, for example, the image of John Glenn, who's been told his heat shield may have come loose. And I've pinpointed this exact moment when he's re-entering the atmosphere and there's this orange glow in the capsule. And we can now clearly see him in this moment. It's just this portrait of courage. So we see awe and wonder in their face as they look out of the windows. And that's something that there's one particularly poignant one of Jim Lovell doing just that. Jim Lovell, who sadly, of course, has recently passed away. What he wanted the book to do, he's obviously very prominent throughout. We see him looking out of the window. He had 2 Gemini missions. And what he wanted the book to do is just to share the awe and wonder that he experienced when he looked out of those windows at Earth and remind us all of the beauty of our home planet. Because I think one thing that will strike people when you go through the book is those photographs of Earth are just absolutely stunning. You know, they're inherently stunning anyway. And the Gemini missions took this incredible photography, perhaps some of the finest photographs of Earth ever captured on film, because they went to altitudes way beyond where we go today. So the International Space Station orbits around 200, 250 miles. Gemini 11 went to 850 miles. In fact, they held the record until only last year. So that's part of the reason that the shots of Earth are also just particularly stunning.
To learn more, the book is Gemini and Mercury Remastered by Andy Saunders. Andy, thank you for talking with me today.
Thank you for having me on.
If you'd like to purchase Gemini and Mercury Remastered, I've placed a link for you in the description below. If you enjoyed this conversation, please subscribe, like, and click on the bell so you know when I post new interviews. Meanwhile, here are 2 more books you might find interesting. I'm Dan Skinner. Thank you for watching this edition of Some Books Considered.